Now, here two things become important. What is property and what is ownership? What is property is something that is not defined in the law, and there are judgments which have said that property basically means the interest that a person has in the property. There is again no definition of the term ownership. We've already seen the attributes to the ownership. Now we will have to see what defines an ownership, or how do you verify whether the person has ownership or no. This process of verifying the ownership is called title verification, and ownership is derived from the term title. Now what is a title? Again, I'll say that there is no definition which is prescribed in the law, but title is basically a bundle of rights which a person has in respect to a particular property. Now why is title verification important? When the loan suppose goes in default and the housing finance company wants to take over the property, sell it off and realize its dues, at that time it should not happen that the housing finance company does not have the right to do so. And this right of not being able to do is because of the fact that the person who created the charge in the first place, himself or herself never had the right to give this charge or mortgage to the housing finance company. And that is why it is very important for the finance company to ensure in the first place itself that the person who is creating this charge has the right to create the charge, and only then will the finance company get a right to be able to sell the property, enforce it and realize its dues if need be. Now, how is a title verification done? There are multiple steps to title verification, and the first step is to check how the ownership is derived, or how has the person who is creating the mortgage become the owner of the property. The second stage in the title due diligence is that the person who is creating the charge, assuming he is the owner, does he have the right to create this charge? Because there are times when you may be the owner of the property but you do not have the right to create this charge. This typically happens in those properties which are given by the government or housing boards, where suppose the Maharashtra Housing Authority or the MAHADA has given you a property. You may be the owner of that property, but then there are restrictions on transferring of the property or creating a mortgage. Of course, there are ways to do that which we will come to later on, but you should have the authority to create the charge. Otherwise, your ownership may be there but the charge is still invalid. The third point is that you have to check whether there are any existing charges or encumbrances on the property. As I have said repeatedly, that the finance company is taking security of the property with the sole intent that if in the future this loan goes into default, the finance company is able to sell it and realize it. Now, take for example that you are creating a charge. You are a housing finance company and you are creating a charge on the property belonging to Mr. A. Now, at the time of sale, if the loan has gone bad and you are wanting to sell, and that time you realize that this property was also charged to another bank, and now the borrower is out of the loan because he is already defaulted, and now these two banks are fighting for the ownership of the property and as to which bank has the right over the property. So to avoid such a situation, it is advisable that in the first place itself you ensure that there are no other charges which are subsisting on this property, or if there are any such charges, you ensure that you have taken a conscious call based on your loan to value ratio, which we've already covered in the earlier parts of this session. The next is, assuming all of this is in place, the property which is constructed on that land, whether adequate approvals have been taken for the construction of the property. There are laws which govern construction. For example, you can't start constructing a property on a land which belongs to the defense establishments. So you can't start constructing a property on, say, a land which belongs to the army or to the navy. You can't also construct a property on lands which have been designated as coastal zones. So in 2011, the government came up with a notification and earmarked certain areas to be coastal regulation zones. This was done with a view to protecting the environment and the sea life. So on these lands, there are restrictions which are placed on construction of the property of any nature. You need to go through a lot of approvals before you start constructing. The next is FSI. So you would have heard of this term FSI. It is an acronym and the full form is Floor Space Index. Floor Space Index is nothing but the area which can be constructed on a particular area of land. So assuming you have a land which is 100 square feet and the FSI which is granted by the government is 2, then the maximum construction that can be done is 200 square feet and not beyond that. So that is FSI. If there is a construction which is in violation of the FSI norms, so if you go ahead and construct 300 square feet, then the government or the authorities are in their full right and capacity to come and demolish the extra construction that you've done. The other approvals that you need to take is that if you are constructing a property which is in close periphery of say an airport or a jail, then you also need to consider that you will need approvals from the Airports Authority of India or the jail authorities. This is with the view of security and the rules which are prescribed under the Airport Authority's rules, right? The next one is that assuming all of this is in place, all the permissions are there, the documents are there, they are authentic, you've checked everything. The next and the most important thing that needs to be verified is whether stamp duty has been paid. Now, stamp duty is nothing but a tax that needs to be paid on every agreement that is done. So these rules differ from state to state, and I'll not get into specifics, but each state has its own set of rules where they have prescribed the documents on which a certain amount of stamp duty that needs to be paid. So assuming on an immovable property transaction worth 1 crore, the stamp duty payable is 5 lakhs, and if anything less than 5 lakhs has been paid, the document will have repercussions and extra stamp duty, penalty, etc. will need to be paid before the housing finance company can actually enforce the security. So this will have an impact of compromising the security which is available with the housing finance company. So you have to be sure of the fact that the stamp duties have been paid properly and adequately. The next important thing is that there are certain properties or certain areas which have been earmarked as heritage sites or heritage property. For all those people who live in Mumbai, you must be aware of the belt on Marine Drive. So all those buildings have been earmarked as heritage property. You can't start construction or demolishing them and making changes without the approval of the authorities. So all these things need to be verified